Hi, everybody. My name is Dorothea von Moltke, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this conversation now between Michael Mechanic and David Korn, two veteran journalists with Mother Jones Magazine. And in a minute, they will be discussing Michael's new book. I have it here, Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. There's the book. Just out. So we have about an hour together, and we will be sure to leave ample time at the end for your questions. So I want to make sure you know how to put those in the queue. There is an Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screens, if you want to just take a second and find that. And please just click on it and type your questions in there. The chat will come down during in a minute during the conversation itself. So just line up your questions as they come to you. That actually helps us so that we know and can gauge a little bit better how much time to leave for the Q&A. So don't be shy. And right above the Ask a Question button is another button, which you can click to order a copy of Jackpot from Labyrinth. And you'll get 10% off if you enter Mechanic as the discount code at checkout. So just a click away. So it's a pleasure now to introduce our speakers. Michael Mechanic is longtime senior editor at Mother Jones Magazine, where he writes and edits everything from breaking news to award-winning essays and feature stories. And David Korn is Mother Jones's Washington bureau chief, as well as an on-air analyst for MSNBC, where many of you will have heard and seen him. He is the co-author, together with Michael Isikoff, of the New York Times #1 bestseller, Russian Roulette, the Inside Story of Putin's War on America and the Election of Donald Trump. He is also the author of 3 other best-selling books. Those are Showdown, Hubris, and The Lies of George W. Bush. On now, though, to our discussion of Jackpot, a book about which none other than Bill Moyers has just recently said that, and I'm going to quote Bill Moyers, that it recalls the muckraking reporting of America's first Gilded Age, when dogged, prophetic journalists exposed the giants of crooked capitalism and, voila, inspired progressive forces that changed the country. It's worth adding that this expose is one that sort of practices what it preaches, namely that if there is to be a revolution that addresses economic injustice, and Michael is clear that there must be one, then this revolution, and here I'm quoting him, will only be one with empathy, education, understanding, and personal commitment. All these are on display in Jackpot, which, while clearly, undeniably satisfying the voyeur in us who wants to look inside the worlds of the interiors and the interior lives of the super wealthy, in fact, he's out to help us understand that wealth often actually comes at its own great cost to the rich, even as the price that society pays for that wealth is just as extravagant as the riches are, and riches about which we are now going to hear. And with that, let me just turn things over by bringing our 2 guests up on the screen. Here's David Korn, and now our author, Michael Mechanic. Welcome to both of you. It's great to have you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation very much. Take it away.
Well, thanks so much. I am very pleased to be here. I've worked with Mike for many years at Mother Jones, and I've read him and been edited by him, and we still are on good talking terms. That's a good sign. But most importantly, I just love this book. I mean, I finished it this afternoon. I get invited to do a lot of these type of events and to blurb books, often from people I know, and often I don't really want to. But in this case, the book is fabulous, tremendously well written, and as timely as one could be. And so I thank you, Mike, for making me read the book, and for inviting me to have this conversation with you. Which is really all about getting people to read the book. So you can order the book on that little green button by checking the box there, the green box. But you can decide to do that at the end of this as well. Those are your two choices: order now or order later. So let's just start with something that just is in the news. And I'm getting an echo. I hope.
I was just going to say, David, that I'm getting that too, and wanted to make sure that you're looking at your browsers and that there's only a single Crowdcast tab open. That is generally the culprit of feedback. Michael, do you also only have?
I already checked.
I've checked, and I have one Crowdcast thing open. I have no other browser open. Please bear with us.
My suggestion is, so I'm now not hearing it. My suggestion is that we forge ahead, and then if it stays disturbing, then we will do the old sort of equivalent of unplugging and replugging, which is leaving and coming back in. But let's see if we can avoid that. Okay.
Okay.
Well, thanks for sticking with us, everyone.
Yeah, we will carry on. So I'm sure that most of the people who are here have heard the news that Derek Chauvin was found guilty on all three counts in the horrific George Floyd case that just happened about 45 minutes ago or so. And I was going to ask you about this later in the show, but let's just start with it now. First, an overview. This book is a survey, an anthropological exploration, an expedition into the world of the super rich, in which Mike tries to understand them, but also, more importantly, tries to show how they affect society at large, for good and bad, mostly for bad, to have such wealth accumulation and such an imbalance in wealth distribution throughout society. And one of the aspects that you look at is sort of intergenerational wealth, and how wealth basically leads to other wealth, and how that creates tremendous inequities in society. And of course, one of the greatest examples of that is wealth for Black Americans, or the lack thereof. We also talk about this with women and with Latinos too. So, we still are in the middle of this very hard to reckon with reckoning, with inequality and racial injustice. And it is just such a talking point of people who don't want to recognize the problem, that everything's kind of equal now. We don't have Jim Crow. Slavery has been gone for a couple generations. And so what's the big whoop? If you are smart enough, good enough, pretty enough, whatever, network well enough, do all the right things, there's no reason why you can't make it. And America is an even playing field. That is just such a hard to burst myth. And it has racial connotations, class connotations, and gender connotations. But so looking at the race connotation, which is one of the chapters in your book, just explain the Black wealth gap, and not just that it exists, but how it came to be, and just how we're still living with that, with the roots of that today.
I mean, I think it's becoming more acknowledged than it used to be, especially with the George Floyd protests, where it became not just protests against police abuse of Black people. It became also about the lack of Black opportunity. And I think you saw fairly recently in a lot of companies, including Mother Jones, for instance, the employees of color kind of got together and they went to the management and said, we want changes made, and we want to be listened to more. We want to be represented at the higher levels in the boardrooms and promoted and so forth. And I've been hearing about this happening in companies all around. Biden during the campaign was the first time I'd ever heard a mainstream candidate use the term Black wealth, because in America, when we talk about racial disparities, it's almost always basics. It's basic housing, clean air, clean water, human rights. And that's not enough. I mean, we are supposed to be a land of equal opportunity, and we have not been for Black people. And I think there's a lot of white people who don't think about that. I mean, maybe when they think deeply about it, they do, but they go around saying, oh yeah, slavery, that was ages ago. Quit using it as an excuse. But slavery was only the beginning. I met one of my sources the chapter is called Thriving While Black. I'm looking at Black wealth, specifically the obstacles to it. And the source, Erwin Raphael, he was actually a very highly placed auto executive, and now he just moved over to Amazon, by the way. He wanted to talk about what he called the black tax, which was coined by an author named Sean Rochester. And the black tax is all the policies, official and otherwise, that have been put in place over time to suppress the opportunity of Black people to accumulate wealth in this country. And it's profound. Slavery was the 100% black tax, which took away all economic opportunity whatsoever, not to mention lives and so forth. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, there were not only deliberate rules in place that kept Black people from making money and getting money and thriving, but there were also opportunities given to white people that were not given to Black people. The first one was the Homestead Acts. Even before the Civil War ended, the U.S. government was the biggest public to private wealth transfer in the history of this country. They gave away, I think, 14% of the landmass of the United States that belonged to the federal government, and they gave it to private individuals, 160-acre parcels. And of course, it started during the Civil War, so Black people couldn't take advantage of it. And then it continued afterwards. But in the end, something like 1.4 million white families got land, which then was the basis of intergenerational wealth. It's what you pass to your children. And 5,000 Black families, 1.4 million versus 5,000. And so all those families then had land that they could farm, they could pass it along, and the Black families didn't.
There's a statistic in that chapter that 1 out of 4 Americans, or some very high number, can attribute trace their family back to homesteaders, or so wealth connected to homesteaders, right?
Yeah, that's right. 1 in 4 white American adults.
Yeah, that's staggering.
Yeah,
that is just staggering. So 1 out of every 4 people got a leg up, and more importantly, 98 out of 100 or 99 out of 100 Black families at that point in time, maybe 99.9, whatever it was, did not get that leg up.
Right, and this has happened several times. It happened with the GI Bill, which because it happened with housing, of course, redlining. Black people could not get a loan in this country at a reasonable rate because the federal government backed insured mortgage loans only for white communities. And then the GI Bill, because of the same loan policies, and also because it was hard for Black people to get into colleges, they couldn't take advantage of the GI Bill in the same way. And that was a huge mobility incident for white families. And so, a lot of these very wealthy people walk around saying, I was self-made, right? And it's like, well, yeah, you were self-made. I always say, who built the roads?
Right.
Who built all the research that the internet depended on? It was like the federal government, right? But beyond that, losing my train of thought.
They're not self-made.
Yeah, right. You're not self-made because somebody back in your past got a loan from the government. It was that a Black person could not have gotten. Or they got the GI Bill, and that allowed them to buy the house, which appreciated in value because it was in a white community, as opposed to. And in fact, there's also between Black communities and white communities now, real estate doesn't appreciate in Black communities the way it does in white communities. So wealth grows much more slowly if you actually have it. You actually have to make a choice if you're Black. Do I invest in a white community or do I invest in a Black community where my kids will see their faces reflected in the culture, but you're probably not going to have much appreciation of the value of your real estate.
One thing that I appreciate in reading that chapter is I think, and I'm sure most of the people listening tonight realize that there have been impediments to Black Americans, Latino Americans, and others over the years, and that they are structural impediments. But the severity of them and the disparity between the advantage that were given to white Americans that Black and brown Americans did not get, and then it was just And it wasn't just slavery, it was those successive waves. Every time America took a step forward, most times America took a step forward, it was a much bigger step for white Americans than for non-white Americans, if even non-white Americans were included in the step at all. And so there's a cumulative effect on all this. And it really, and it goes up through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, now, because it was still hard to get loans, and there was still a lot of redlining in the 90s and then going into the beginning of this decade. So even
still happens.
Yes. So even if we've addressed some of this, the foundation that was built for white Americans' prosperity, where there is some, versus foundation, it's like building a damn house, right? If you don't have a solid foundation, you can't come along and add on. You can't build. You can't develop it. And and if you have rot in the floorboards, and you just can't keep moving along. Right. So I thought that was it was sort of a well-told story, and gives a fuller, at least to me, a fuller understanding of the disparity and the inequality here, and how there's just still so many different aspects of this that need to be remedied in order to get us anywhere close to what we might consider a decent playing field. But I want to switch gears a little bit, because you got to do something that a lot of us don't get to do. You got to hang out with very, very wealthy people in their native habitats, right? It's like I think of you like Wild Kingdom here. We are now visiting, studying this strange creature. See that mansion up ahead? Shh, we're going to try to get as close as we can. Letting us in the gate. So you spend a lot of time with people who are wealthy, with people who work for wealthy people, who provide services that the rest of us can barely dream of. And I'm just going to ask you, as you got into that, what was sort of one of the biggest surprises for you as you probed the world of wealth?
Well, I was sort of surprised at all the opportunities. For one, the extent of the opportunities to avoid taxes and to kind of cheat the system that people can take advantage of. And we all know there's some of that going on. Let me give you an example. I was at something called the Concours d'Elegance, which at Pebble Beach. It's a classic car show. All the billionaires are there showing off their Ferraris, and wandering around and drinking champagne on the lawn, the 18th fairway of Pebble Beach. And so I went there and just sort of, I didn't know anybody there. I just had to sort of strike up conversations with people, and it was quite interesting. But at one point, they have also auto auctions there. And there was a guy who had a Ferrari that was on the block it was supposed to go from between $5 and $7 million. And there were some guys around him explaining how he should take his profits and roll them into an opportunity zone. Now, you've heard of these things, right? Trump talks about him.
Jared Kushner.
Yeah, right, Kushner. So the opportunity zones are these areas that they set aside, and they want to incentivize development in those areas. They're poor areas. And so they offer a deal to developers. We'll give you a big break on profits, tax break on profits, if you develop a project here. And so what these guys do is they kind of gerrymander the maps so that the poor area is linked to an upscale area. And then they build their luxury hotel or condos in the upscale area, and they claim the tax deduction, which is just a big scam, right? And they know it, and they know it's wrong, but they do it anyway. And so this guy was talking to the Ferrari owner. He says, what you got to do, he said, I've done this for several people already. He says, you take the profit, you put it into a shovel-ready project in an opportunity zone that's not really an opportunity zone. And so, that's pretty appalling. Right. And these guys are just talking about it like it's a cup of tea, right? It's just normal behavior. There is a kind of bubble mentality among the wealthy, where things that we would consider weird and appalling and not normal are just normal. You go to a party and the guy's talking about his private jet and his private equity thing, and the ridiculous boarding school his child's going to, and everyone would be like, what? But for them, it's just Yeah, it's just Bob and his private jet.
Now there was one Dodge. It's not a big part of I think of the national budget, but I just thought it was a pretty interesting Dodge. That was a way to get a yacht without paying the sales tax.
Yeah, right. You if you buy a little, bass boat or a rowboat, you pay taxes. If you buy a $50 million yacht, you can just go and register it in international waters. You fly your lawyers out there on your helicopter, and
the yacht is in international waters. It's beyond whatever the limit,
right. So then you take pictures of the GPS with the partners signing the deal, and the lawyers are there, and then you pay no taxes. No sales taxes.
So if a yacht is $50 million and taxes are 10%, 8%, whatever they might be, you're talking $5 million in sales tax.
Oh yeah. And actually some states have maximum sales taxes on luxury items. For instance, in New Jersey, if you buy a yacht, I think the maximum tax is $20,000. So you can buy a $100 million yacht and pay $20,000 in taxes. In Florida, it's even less, I believe. South Carolina has a maximum $500 tax on any luxury item. So you could buy a Gulfstream jet, pay $500 in sales tax, which is about what you'd pay on a Honda Civic, right?
Oh yeah, I think you might pay more, but you pay for more.
You would pay
a lot more. Wow. Yeah. And was there anything that struck you as you saw that was the most? Well, I guess the nice word is ostentatious. The less polite word is the most obscene use of money.
Oh man, I mean there are several things, but here's one that I think I mentioned it in the book, but this guy was not really in my book because he said I don't want to be in there because I'm a private person. Go visit this guy. He's a car collector. It has these unbelievable cars. One of which I sat in, and this car is literally worth at least 20 times what my house is worth. It was not a comfortable car. It was an old classic. So this guy had built a scale model, like the perfection of the city of Monaco, to do a slot car Monaco Grand Prix. So it's like a slot car race through the city, but every building was perfect. He had Jacques Cousteau's laboratory. You could look through the window of this building on the seaside with waves crashing and see the fish tanks inside. Each little hay bale along the route, the racing route, was like handcrafted by Italian, craftspeople. And he had spent something like $400,000 doing this. And he said, my wife stopped me. She said, you can't spend any more on this. And also, apparently the Prince of Monaco heard about this, and he came by to drink wine and play slot cars with this guy. So, but he didn't want to be in the book because a lot of people of that level of wealth don't want to be known. Billionaires they just don't want to talk to you about things like this at all.
Well, that leads me to my next question in a way. Yeah. Famously, F. Scott Fitzgerald said, the rich are different than you and I. And Hemingway responded, yes, they have more money. But the question, that some of us wonder is just how different are they? Does having these immense amounts of money change them? I mean, does it change some, not others, in one way or a different way? You write about wealth anxiety in the book, and you also, at one point, say are wealthy people generally assholes? And you seem to suggest not necessarily, but perhaps in some ways, or perhaps for some. So hanging out with the 0.001%, what did you walk away with in terms of, vapid, abstract generalizations?
Most of the people that agreed to be in my book were people I kind of liked them. They weren't jerks. On the other hand, they might have been a self-selecting group, right? Maybe the jerks didn't want to talk to me. So, yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about all the research that's done on wealth, it's usually on a gradient of sort of high income to low income, but the super, super, super wealthy never participate in this kind of research because they're not interested, right? They they are sequestered. They're isolated. They have teams of people around them that keep them from doing any of this kind of thing and participating in books like mine, right? They don't want to be, they don't want their worlds known to others because they just say it's no one's business, right? So as a result, you have to kind of extrapolate. You can't really say for sure how these are, and you also don't. The other thing is the research is not before and after. It looks at wealth on a gradient, but we don't have data to say this guy was middle class and now he is a billionaire, and here's how he's changed. There's just no, the sample sizes are too small. You just can't get real data. So it's all anecdotal. You definitely hear people talk about billionaires being miserable. I've heard a lot of people. In fact, I just talked to someone last week who had met Malcolm Forbes, and they said he was completely miserable. He hated his children, hated his own children. The wealth of that level.
I can tell you,
through families.
Yeah, he threw very big parties in New York City in the '80s. They were kind of well renowned for being completely over the top and extreme. In many ways that his son, Steve Forbes, would not want to talk about if he were running for the Republican presidential nomination. But yeah, you were about to say that it drives stakes through families. How so?
It can certainly. Or just back to how wealth changes people, right? Yeah. I actually asked that question to a bunch of people, including some of the wealthy people. And like Nick Hanauer was, he's almost a billionaire. He's also turned into an anti-inequality crusader. He's up in Seattle, an investor. And he said, "Oh yeah, I totally think it changes people. I think it, he thinks a lot of the billionaires are jerks, right?" But one refrain you hear a lot is, it doesn't change you so much as amplify your pre-existing tendencies. So if you were a jerk before, you're going to be a mega jerk. If you were a good person before, you can do amazingly good things. And I suppose it's true that you have the resources to do amazing things if you want to dedicate your energy to it. Some do, but most of them just go about their lives and keep accumulating wealth.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that to a degree. What are the negative effects for the rest of us, for society, of the mega accumulation of wealth in such a small number of hands and bank accounts, mainly in the Cayman Islands and elsewhere? What is that? Because you get at this at the book. What does that mean culturally, politically, financially, economically, for the rest of our nation to have, so much money flowing to the top?
Well, look, David, a thriving middle class is healthy for a society. When you don't have when you have this division, the pulling apart of society by wealth and the segregation of people by wealth, it creates rifts. It creates rifts in how we understand each other, our empathy for one another, and the people at the top have such undue political influence, the ability to get things passed in their own interests, which are different from the interests of the public. And if you let this sort of go on without putting any hooks in it, eventually you create a lot of unfairness. And so the researchers have they talk about something called income segregation. And that's a phenomenon by which it's like wealth flight. It's like the wealthy people leave the middle class neighborhoods, they go over here. And we've seen the difference between CEO salary and worker salary expand radically since probably the 70s, right? It's hundreds of times now. And so that CEO is not going to live anywhere near his workers. He's going to live in the mansion on the hill along with all the other folks who make 100 times their workers. And so that person never has any interaction with the people over here. And ultimately, the poor and middle class people start looking at the rich with, indignance, and the rich start looking over there saying they deserve their lot because, I deserve my success because I worked hard, and these people obviously are doing something wrong because they weren't successful. And so you got to sort of tearing at the fabric of society. We have animosity towards each other, even though, we want to be in the 1%. We also dislike the 1%. We have a bad impression of them. And when you have these kinds of rifts, I think it starts creating the kinds of politics we're seeing today. Where we look at our political opponents as enemies, and that's all just of a piece of the disparities in wealth in our society.
Well, is there? I mean, the fact that Jeff Bezos is worth more money than God, if God had a checkbook, and 120 billion, 130 billion. I can't keep track.
Changes by the day.
Yeah, and went up a tremendous amount during the pandemic, of course. The fact that he's worth that much, and that we have other super wealthy people out there. I mean, would it matter if we had a thriving middle class at the same time, that there were people who were that rich? Is there a reason we don't have a thriving middle class because we allow wealth to coagulate, in such large proportions with so few? I mean, what is the, I understand, the social rift here, but also is there an economic price? Is it harder to have a healthy middle class if so much wealth is flowing to people at the top? Is it a zero-sum game? Is the pie only a certain size?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, yeah, you can expand and build wealth in a society, but the pie is always going to be limited, and you always have the people at the top sucking resources from the bottom. In fact, that's what you see in the stock market. There's a study I cite in the book that says, here's the gains in the market up through, I think, up through the 70s or something like this. And the gains were actually tied to real economic growth. When you look at the gains in the markets from the 80s onward, there's this very little connection with actual economic growth. It's actually the people at the top are figuring out how to suck more from the bottom and suck more from the workers and the productivity of the workers, whereas the workers aren't making any more money than they were before. Their wages have been stagnant. So, and also you have these guys like Bezos who only recently established the $15 minimum wage for Amazon. I mean, Zuckerberg did it in 2015. He doesn't have a lot of minimum wage workers. It's at Facebook, I don't think, but there's been a number of companies who that have done this, but they're doing it to stay competitive for, drawing new employees. And also, you saw what Bezos did. As soon as he raised it, he went on a rampage to try and get it raised to 15 on the federal level. I mean, which is good, but he's doing it for competitive reasons. He wants everyone to pay the same wage as he does.
Right, and of course,
but he gets to look good by doing that.
And of course, $15 an hour is still bupkis for a lot of cities and places. If that translates to $30,000 a year, if at the new Amazon, headquarters in Northern Virginia here, or the one they wanted to put in Queens, New York, if they were paying that at that $15 an hour in any of these places, their employees could literally not survive. But so let's talk about wealthy people doing good, because or the potential for them to do good, or how they do bad by trying to do good, or they don't do enough good. I mean, these are all issues that you look at the book, and they have all this money, and to a certain degree, a certain number of them use it charitably. Yet, as you point out in different ways in the book, the role of charity in our society can be a bit of a rigged game as well. And it's not often that the charity makes up for the downside or the negative consequences of this accumulated wealth. So we're going to go to questions in a little bit, but talk about that. How we look at the philanthropists out there, and you have Bezos now is pledged to give money to this and that. Zuckerberg's giving money away. Bloomberg's famous for doing it. But then the Koch brothers have their charitable endeavors, what they call charitable endeavors. But not all this is always for or contributes to the greater public good.
Right. I mean, a public charity, and there's something like 1.8 million charities in the U.S. The definition of what a charity is so lax, so permissive that almost anything can qualify. And so you have hate groups that are qualified as charities, white nationalist groups, anti-LGBT groups. You have just strange little quirky groups. I think in the book of the Camellia Appreciation Society, harmless, right? But there's, philanthropy can be used. Well, the other thing to point out is we subsidize charitable giving, and we subsidize it through the charitable deduction. And for instance, let's say it's something like 12% of people itemize on their tax return. You can only take the charitable deduction if you itemize. And so if, let's say I take the standard deduction and I donate $1,000 to Feeding America, and Jeff Bezos donates $1,000 to Feeding America, and his, let's say his effective tax rate is 20%. Well, he gets to deduct that. So he ends up paying $800 and I end up paying $1,000 for the same thing. Is that fair? Is that a good way to promote charitable giving, just by giving to the 10% who can itemize their deductions? It doesn't really make a lot of sense.
And so if he gives away $2 billion,
oh yeah,
he will be saving
20 million, is it? I mean, I'm just thinking the math is wrong, but a large amount of money. And right. These guys already have so many absurd advantages to ways to keep their money, through avoiding the estate tax, for instance, keeping money in families. Now, Bezos, unlike his former wife, Mackenzie Scott, has not signed the giving pledge, the Bill Gates giving pledge, which is signed by a very small fraction of the world's billionaires.
Explain what that is.
So Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, I think in 2010, got together with a bunch of other billionaires and said, hey, we need to give back and encourage giving back. So we're going to take this pledge. We're going to give away the majority of our wealth. And of course, majority means half plus a penny. And the other thing is, originally they said, well, during our lifetime, but now they've changed it. They said, now it's in life or your estate. And in fact, I interviewed this guy, Rob Reich, who wrote a book called Just Giving. He's a Stanford professor. And one thing he pointed out, he said, you look at that list and maybe all but 2 of them have more money now than when they signed the pledge. Because when at that level of wealth, money comes at you so fast, it rolls in so fast, you cannot even shovel it out the door properly. Now, Mackenzie Scott gave away almost $8 billion in 2020. And she was really a blueprint for giving in the future. She gave away to not only to social justice causes and helping people out in the pandemic, she looked for causes that would actually change the playing field. So to make the system fairer, I mean, the idea is if you can change the system so philanthropy is no longer needed as much. I think philanthropy is a good thing. And I don't, I would hail someone for trying to do good with their money. The questions you have to ask is, are we doing it right, first of all? And is this, what is this person's motivation for giving? Are they doing it for the tax breaks? Are they doing it to burnish reputations because they were screwing over their workers or damaging the environment? I mean, there's a lot of that kind of thing that goes on at the very high level.
There's a great quote that I'd never heard before from that radical Republican, Theodore Roosevelt, on page 275. I'm going to remind people, you can order the book by clicking on that green box, and you can read 275 and page 274 and 276 on your own. But the quote from Teddy Roosevelt, which was in reference to John D. Rockefeller trying to set up a charity with his fortune, which he needed basically his own piece of legislation to do this. He tried to do it with Congress to have them basically approve of a charity that would have tax benefits, and they ended up not going along. So he got the New York State legislature to do this. So in the middle of this fight, Roosevelt said, no amount of charities in spending such fortunes can compensate in any way for the misconduct in acquiring them. Whoa, this is like Occupy Wall Street here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is like, it's, who was it that said every great fortune began with a crime? Was that Dostoevsky, or was it Tolstoy, or Dickens? I want somebody like that. You can Google it. But here he was clearly saying that there is no compensation for becoming a robber baron or such a captain of industry that you have so much control and power with your money. And I reported on charities and foundations, and they only have to give away 5% of what so if you're a very wealthy person. I did a story just last year about a fellow who was involved in some shenanigans using a foundation and a religious charity, in that so he can move, if he has, and he had billions, he can move billions or hundreds of millions or tens of millions into a foundation that is run by his family. The officers are his family members or his own personal accountants, and he's a member too. The money can sit there. He only has to give away 5% a year, and even that, this foundation, this charity did not meet that. But there's no real policing or enforcement of this. And then he ended up giving hundreds of millions of dollars to a small synagogue in Brooklyn, of which he is the president. And then the money goes to the synagogue, which is a charitable organization that doesn't even have to file a proper tax return because it's a religious institution, and you have no idea what they did with that money.
Right.
So it just disappears into the ether.
There are so many opportunities for self-dealing in the big philanthropy, especially with the 5%, for instance. That includes overhead.
Yes. So what you pay your daughter-in-law or your son-in-law to be the president, your fancy annual events, the office space. I mean, yeah,
it all comes out of the 5%.
Right. So you could basically, and then of course there's the political side of it, where you have people like the Koch brothers, and it happens on the left too, who give to, charities that have a political basis. And, it could be something that we would like to see more voter registration, right? Groups that are dedicated to that. But it also could be groups that are dedicated to voter suppression,
right?
As a social welfare organization.
Right. And they say this all goes under education.
Yes.
And now, education can be anything. You can educate people to do bad things.
Now, there was one issue that you raise in the book, but you don't give us an answer.
Uh-oh.
That is, the question comes up in a few times in different conversations, like, what is too much? What is too much wealth? If you're going to think about limiting accumulation of wealth, and you can do that through taxation and other methods, different corporate governance that keeps the gap between CEO pay and worker pay at a certain level. I mean, there are different ways to limit wealth. But one question I kept thinking is, well, what is too much? 65 billion is too much, or 1 billion, or half a billion, 1/10 of a billion. I remember that great scene in Wall Street, where Gordon Gekko, the Michael Douglas character, talking about being rich, and his mentor, who's turned on him, says, "How much money do you need? How many yachts can you water ski behind?" So if we were going to try to even out the playing field, where would you? What limitation? If you're king, what limitation would you?
We don't have kings here in America. I mean, I'm not a policymaker. It's not really my choice to do that. But what's interesting, just when you ask how much that is both a societal question and a personal question. Because the interesting thing is, you say, what's the end game for these guys? I mean, you have billions of dollars. You cannot possibly spend that money. Why do you want to accumulate more? What is your stopping point? On a slightly lower level, you find that people always feel a little bit financially insecure, no matter what number they hit. They say, "Oh, if I just had 20 million, I would be good." they get to 20 million. If we just had 30 million, that would be good. And it's a moving target. And everybody says this. It just keeps shifting because you start expanding your lifestyle, and then you want that next little thing. And then it becomes a way of measuring yourself, or a way other people measure you. In certain crowd, right? It's as Richard Watts, this guy in my book said it. He goes to Mitt Romney's shindig, where everyone had at least $500 million. He says, you're in a room like that, you pretty quickly learn who has the biggest yacht. He goes, and I could say that in ways that are nasty. So he's, you see what he's saying. As far as policy, I mean, well, Elizabeth Warren says $50 million, right, is where we should start chipping away at it, and more for billionaires. But I guess the question, it's arbitrary, right? Is it billionaire? Is it 500 million? Is it 10 billion? The fact is, there was a lot of talk, especially during the campaign with Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, on is it moral for a society to have, is it ethical for a society to have billionaires? And the fact is, these guys wouldn't be billionaires if our rules were in place that didn't reward wealth over work. The reason they're as rich as they are is because we favor capital over labor. And also they have a million ways to avoid paying taxes. So, and we subsidize them in many ways, actually. Not, is in education of their children. We subsidize them. We subsidize their philanthropy. We subsidize their business profits by creating a stable society, and where property is protected by police and all this stuff.
Well, my favorite subsidy is that, you look at people who work at Walmart and other places like that, and we subsidize them by providing food stamps, that they do not pay their workers a living wage. And it's not just Walmart, others as well. And so we come along with our tax money, you, me, everyone who's listening, and we kick in so that people then can, get the food they need, even though they are working in full-time jobs or the best part-time jobs they can find.
Right. It looks like we have some questions.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for this conversation and for taking us into this book. Many dimensions of it. There are many more, and we have a little more time, and maybe we can pull at some more threads also as we continue. I'm going to go ahead and actually bring the chat back up too, just in case there's anyone who prefers putting a question in the chat. That's fine too. Otherwise, the simplest way for me would be to find them if you just click on that Ask a Question button again. And there is someone here who's found her way. Let's see, Charlotte Bialek. To that button, and her question actually sort of connects really nicely with where your conversation just landed. She asks, if instead of asking what is too much, we ask how much is enough, how would the conversation around wealth change?
Instead of asking how much is too much, how much is enough, how much is too little?
Well, how much is in? Yeah, well, I mean, maybe how much is enough for a floor for everybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to me that she's not asking how much is too little. I think she's asking, is there? I don't know if this connects to the sort of an actual living wage, or to questions about what does a fulfilled and secure life look like? I don't know. Please.
Okay, so I guess I can address that. If you're talking about sort of satisfaction and happiness, there's been a lot of studies of populations, and again, they don't really get the super rich involved in these kinds of studies because the sample size is so small. So you can't say a whole lot about this mega rich, but they find that life satisfaction, sort of positive emotions, they increase with income up to a certain point, and it's very modest. It's $65,000 in the study that I cite. Then negative emotions drop off as wealth increases up to $95,000 or so. It's called a satiation point. And then there's something called I can't remember what it's called, but it's sort of how you think about how you measure up in life, and that peaks at $105,000. So the notion is that, and maybe you couldn't live in Princeton on this kind of money and have a decent house, but if you have enough that your basic needs are fulfilled, and you don't have to just worry about rent collectors pounding on your door, you have stable housing, you have food, you have enough to save a little bit for your kids' education. I mean, that's what brings, that's what minimizes unhappiness, I should say. Now, as far as happiness comes from our connections to other people, really, and not from money. I talk a lot about extrinsic versus intrinsic values, and extrinsic is sort of the materialistic, consumed with success and money and appearances and how you measure up, and intrinsic is, community mindedness, good, building friendships, building good relationships, those sorts of things. And the people who are intrinsic are much happier than people who are extrinsic.
It's interesting when you talk about, having enough. Different societies create different standards in a way of how much you have to fend for yourself or your family. If you look at sort of like education and healthcare, two things that are essential for people's well-being. In other Western democracies, we tackle that kind of collectively, right? So you don't have to worry about paying for your kids' college education, and you don't have to worry about what would happen if you get hit by a catastrophic illness in terms of the money side of things. Now, a lot of these systems have their problems, and they're going through, some of them are going through financial difficulties more so now than they were 10, 20 years ago. But nevertheless, societies have come together and said, we're going to take this off the table. It's something that you have to worry about, or you have to fend on your own about. And so that sort of gets to the question of what is enough. What do you need to, in terms of your money or level of income security, changes the equation a lot. In America, it's yo-yo, you're on your own, right? It's so much of it is you're on your own.
That's right.
And that is going to, increase, I think, all sorts of insecurities and, financial, but just in general too.
Yeah, we're so obsessed with sort of our individualism in this country and just our ability to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. It's sort of the myth of the American dream, right? You fend for yourself, and we're allergic to the government coming in. But you look at where the happiness is greatest in the world, it's like Finland, where people pay very high taxes and they get very high benefits. In fact, there's a part of the book where I talk about an experiment by Norton and Ariely, where they show people different wealth distributions, pie charts. They had 5,500 American subjects, and when they show them the wealth distribution of Sweden next to the wealth distribution of the United States, and say, but they don't tell them that what they are. So they say, which one of these societies do you want to live in? And they pick Sweden. They all pick Sweden. These are Americans.
In the last year, a couple years, we've seen what's called a reckoning on race. We've seen it somewhat on gender with the Me Too movement as well. On class, we had the Occupy Wall Street movement. It came and it went. There's certainly more discussion of income inequality. Bernie Sanders tried to make that this centerpiece of two presidential campaigns, and he did a good job, but he still ended up not winning the nomination either time out. Is there a reason why a reckoning on class is is sort of further away, or is even harder than a reckoning on race to sort of see as almost a standalone, sustaining movement or issue?
Well, again, it's driven by some of the myths we talked about. The idea of upward mobility, which has been around since de Tocqueville, right? We've always believed that through hard work, we can pull ourselves up and succeed. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's a lot of obstacles in society that keep certain people from moving up, and a lot of it has to do with timing and luck, more than just talent and hard work. We believe in the self-made myth in this country, and that has sort of stopped us from really getting behind redistributive policies, which we call socialism, right? And tackle Elizabeth Warren over it. But a lot of that has to do with the myths that we believe in as Americans, and other parts of the world they don't necessarily believe in. But now there's enough anger. People are really seeing the disparities and feeling the disparities, especially with COVID, that there is some momentum in that direction. You can see it in the policies Biden is putting forward, bold policies that one wouldn't have expected Biden to put forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you had a quote from de Tocqueville that I had forgotten, in which he came to America and he said, "There are no longer any classes." I mean, I think you throw out the rest of his book if that's where his powers of observation led him.
I think that's right.
Right.
So there aren't any more new questions in the queue, and we're approaching the top of the hour. I wanted to ask here's one, and I will tell you what I'll ask in a second. But before I do that, there is a question here. Now that we know that the system is rigged, what chance do we, as average income Americans, have of changing it?
Well, I argue in the book that it's going to take more than just sort of a populist revolution. It's going to take a hearty share of people who are privileged and who are really benefiting from the system we have to kind of have their own reckoning. And maybe COVID has helped with that, and maybe the racial stuff has helped with that, to kind of look around and say, good God, this is unfair, and I'm winning a rigged game, and that's not so fun, is it? Right? And maybe some of those people wake up and actually start doing the work, because one thing I argue is in the spectrum of wealthy people, it's like wealthy people are not bad people. Some are, just like some poor people are bad people, but there's the people the upper end who have the family dynasties and are working their butts off to make sure they keep their privilege. And then there's people like the patriotic millionaires down on the other end, who are this group of very wealthy people who is lobbying for fairer taxation, things like that. And then most people are just wandering about doing their own, they're going about their business and taking care of their kids and going about their daily lives and not paying much attention, even though they are benefiting. And I'm talking not just 0.01 percenters, but 10 percenters. 10 percenters are all doing pretty well. And a lot of us are 10 percenters, right? So those, that's the group that has a lot of the power and clout in society, and that's the group that has to start making noise and saying, hey, we're behind this. We're behind some change now, and we can give up some of our privilege if it's going to bring other people up and have a more prosperous and healthy society. So that's my hope. Maybe I'm naive.
But it's a nice, maybe a nice resting point for this conversation. This doing the work. When I was reading your book, I kept thinking it really does have to include all manner of tax reform. That is for me one big takeaway from your book, and just one dimension of the work that we might do. I'll give a quick shout out here in New Jersey to New Jersey Policy Perspectives, as a just extraordinary progressive group that looks at the New Jersey budget and takes the New Jersey budget as a moral document, and does very, very great research and hard lobbying work on behalf of social justice issues. That was just a plug that seemed to fit this moment.
I do like to say that it's a moral document. The budgets and tax laws are moral documents.
Right. And in reading your book, I was reminded of that so often. So there's much else to talk about in this book. I hope that you will find a copy of it. Maybe I can share in the chat should I share your author website if people want to reach out to you in some way? I'll just quickly do that. It is Read Jackpot.
Easy. ReadJackpot.com.
I think it should be Buy Jackpot, but that's
that's up to you.
Yeah.
That's up to you.
But I recommend it.
Yeah, find a copy and read Jackpot. Find it, please, from an independent bookstore that you love and want to support, Labyrinth or whichever is close to where you are. And that leaves me now to thank the two of you very much for this hour. It was really very interesting to listen in, and thank everyone who tuned in for your time, for your accompaniment in thought. I hope to see many of you in the store. I wish everyone a good night. I wish everyone good health. And I hope to meet the two of you someday in person, perhaps also in the bookstore.
I look forward to going to bookstores once again, particularly independent bookstores.
Yes.
So so next time I'm in Princeton, I will knock on your door.
Please do.
And I'm really grateful to you for hosting us. And thank you so much, David, for joining in this conversation. And I just want to say hi, Aunt Gladys.
Okay.
Excellent. Good. A shout out. So it's been a pleasure. Good night to everybody.
Good night.
Good night.